The house was silent as 17-year-old Sarah sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels. Her parents were out of town on business, leaving her home alone for the first time. She relished the freedom, no curfew or rules to follow. As she settled in for a night of binge-watching her favorite show, she heard a strange noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps, but she knew she was the only one in the house. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just her imagination. But little did she know, the nightmare had only just begun. As the night went on, Sarah became increasingly uneasy. Every creak and groan of the old house made her jump. She locked all the doors and windows and checked the security system repeatedly. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Finally, exhausted and on edge, Sarah decided to go to bed. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached her bedroom, she double-checked the locks and crawled under the covers. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard the footsteps again, louder this time. She sat up, her heart racing. She was sure someone was in the house. Terrified, Sarah reached for her phone to call the police. But it was dead. She had forgotten to charge it. She was trapped, alone, and defenseless. She pulled the covers up to her chin, hoping it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, she heard the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her breathing became shallow. Suddenly, the door to her bedroom creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Sarah couldn't see his face, but she could feel his eyes on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure approached the bed slowly, pulling something out of its pocket. It was a knife. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to push herself further into the wall. Her hands shaking and her voice cracking, she managed to croak out a plea for mercy. But it was too late. The figure lunged toward her, and everything went dark. When Sarah woke up, she was tied to a chair, surrounded by darkness. She tried to scream, but her mouth was gagged. The only sound she could hear was her own labored breathing. She looked around, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. She could see a silhouette of a figure in front of her, and it was holding a knife. The figure started to speak in a low, raspy voice. "Welcome to your new home," it said. "You'll be here for a while." Sarah's heart sank. She realized that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Sarah was trapped without hope. Her captor, a psychopath who had been watching her for weeks, had taken everything from her: her phone, her freedom, and her sense of safety. He had turned her home into a prison, and he was the warden. Sarah tried to escape, but every time she did, she was punished. The psychopath would beat her or cut her, reminding her that he was in control. She lost all sense of time, and the only thing that kept her going was the hope that she would one day be rescued. But that hope was shattered when the psychopath revealed his ultimate plan. He was going to take her to his home and keep her forever, making her his prisoner for the rest of her life. Sarah knew then that she had to escape, no matter the cost. She bided her time, watching the psychopath's every move. One day, while the psychopath was out, Sarah managed to free herself from her restraints. She frantically searched the house for any means of escape, but all the doors and windows were locked from the outside. As she was about to give up hope, she noticed a small, hidden door in the basement. It led to a crawl space under the house, and she realized it was her only chance for freedom. She crawled through the narrow space, scraping her arms and legs on the rough ground. She could hear the psychopath coming back, his footsteps growing louder and louder. She finally emerged from the crawl space outside, gasping for air. She could see the road in the distance and started to run towards it. But she didn't make it far before the psychopath caught up with her. He tackled her to the ground and held the knife to her throat. "I told you, you can never leave," he hissed. But just then, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the psychopath looked up in horror. The police had finally arrived, alerted by a concerned neighbor who had noticed something strange was going on. The psychopath panicked and started to run, but the police caught up with him quickly. Sarah was taken to the hospital where she received treatment for her injuries. She was safe now, but the trauma of her ordeal would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she sat in the hospital bed, she thought about how her life would never be the same again. The home that she had once felt so safe in was now a place of horror and nightmares. She realized that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones that hide under your bed or in your closet. They're the ones that look just like us, the ones that live among us, and the ones that we think we know. Sarah vowed to never let her guard down again, to always be vigilant and to never take her safety for granted. She had survived the unthinkable, and she knew that she could overcome anything that life threw her way. But as she closed her eyes, trying to forget the horrors she'd faced, she knew that she would never truly feel safe again. Story 2. Claws in the walls. As soon as Jane stepped into her empty house, she knew something was wrong. The air was heavy with a sense of unease, and she could feel eyes on her from every shadowy corner. She tried to brush it off as just her imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger as she made her way through the house. It was her first time being home alone for an entire week, and she was excited to have the place all to herself. Her parents had gone on a vacation, and her siblings were off to a summer camp, leaving her to enjoy some peace and quiet. But now, as she wandered through the empty rooms, she wished she had someone to share it with. As the night wore on, Jane became increasingly anxious. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent shivers down her spine. She tried to distract herself with a movie, but the flickering images on the screen only made her more aware of the darkness outside. Finally, she decided to call it a night and went to bed, pulling the covers up tight around her neck. But just as she was about to drift off, she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind her. She tried to ignore it at first, but it grew louder and more persistent, like something was trying to claw its way through the plaster. Jane's heart was racing now, and she knew she couldn't stay in the room a moment longer. She grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the hallway, determined to investigate the source of the noise. As she made her way towards the sound, the darkness seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with its weight. She could hear her own breathing, harsh and ragged in her ears, and the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Finally, she reached the spot where the scratching was coming from. It was a small alcove in the wall, just big enough for something to crawl through. Jane shone her flashlight inside, and what she saw made her scream. There, staring back at her with glowing eyes, was a small, twisted creature. It was no bigger than a rat, but its skin was mottled and scaly, and its teeth were razor sharp. It hissed at her, baring its fangs, and Jane stumbled back in terror. As she backed away, she felt something brush against her ankle. She looked down and, to her horror, saw dozens of the creatures swarming up her legs, their claws digging into her flesh. She screamed and tried to shake them off, but they only clung tighter, dragging her down into the darkness. Jane never made it out of the house alive. Her parents came home to find the place a wreck, the furniture overturned, and the walls clawed to shreds. There was no sign of their daughter, no trace of what had happened to her. But sometimes, on a quiet summer night, you can still hear the scratching in the walls, the skittering of tiny claws. And if you listen closely enough, you might even hear Jane's screams, echoing through the empty house. Story 3, The Never-Ending Nightmare. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation and solitude for Claire. She'd been looking forward to having the house all to herself, with no distractions or interruptions. But as the sun set on the first night, Claire's peaceful weekend quickly turned into a nightmare. As she was reading a book in the living room, she heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. At first, she tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the noise persisted. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around with heavy boots on. Claire's heart started to race as she realized that she was not alone in the house. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the coffee table and slowly made her way up the stairs, her hands shaking with fear. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw a figure standing in the hallway. It was a man, dressed in all black, with his face covered by a ski mask. Claire screamed and swung the candlestick at him, but he was too fast. He tackled her to the ground and knocked the candlestick out of her hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. "I just need a place to hide." Claire didn't believe him, but she was too afraid to fight back. She nodded, and the man dragged her to the spare bedroom, locking the door behind them. Claire was trapped with a stranger, and she had no way of calling for help. She tried to reason with the man, asking him why he was hiding in her house, but he refused to answer. He just sat there, staring at her with cold, unfeeling eyes. As the hours ticked by, Claire's fear turned to desperation. She knew that she had to find a way out before the man hurt her, or worse. She searched the room for any means of escape, but the windows were too small to climb through, and the door was too strong to break down. Just when she thought all hope was lost, she noticed a small trapdoor in the ceiling. It led to the attic, and she realized that it was her only chance for escape. She pushed a chair under the trapdoor and climbed up, pulling herself into the dark, musty attic. She could hear the man shouting and banging on the door below, but she didn't look back. She crawled through the attic, trying to find a way out. But as she reached the other end, she realized that the attic was not as empty as she thought. There was a small, hidden room in the corner of the attic, and it was filled with strange, macabre objects. There were human bones, rusty knives, and jars filled with unknown substances. And in the center of the room, there was a wooden coffin. Claire felt her blood run cold as she realized what she had stumbled upon. The man was not just a stranger hiding in her house. He was a deranged serial killer, and she had narrowly escaped becoming one of his victims. As she tried to catch her breath, she heard the trapdoor creaking open below. The man was coming for her, and she knew that she had to act fast. She climbed into the coffin, closing the lid behind her, and held her breath. She could hear the man moving around in the attic, searching for her. He was getting closer and closer to the coffin, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before he found her. Just when she thought all hope was lost, she heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived, alerted by a neighbor who had heard her screams. The man panicked and tried to escape, but he was caught by the police before he could leave. Claire was rescued, but the horror of that night stayed with her for years. She never felt safe in her own home again, and the memory of the killer's lair in the attic haunted her dreams. Years later, after she had moved to a new city and tried to forget the past, she received a strange package in the mail. It was a small black box with no return address, and when she opened it, she saw a note written in the same handwriting as the killer's. "I found you," the note said, "and I always will." Claire screamed and threw the box across the room, but she knew that the nightmare was far from over. The killer had found her, and she was once again trapped with him. This time, in her mind, she tried to go to the police, but they dismissed her claims, saying that there was no evidence of a crime. She tried to move again, but she knew that the killer would always find her. She was never truly alone, never truly safe, and so Claire lived the rest of her life in fear, haunted by the memory of that one horrific night. She never knew what became of the killer, but she knew that he was out there, watching and waiting, always one step behind her. In the end, it was not the killer who took her life, but the fear that consumed her. She died alone in her apartment, surrounded by locks and alarms, still looking over her shoulder, still waiting for the killer to strike.